the truth. A light in the darkness. A word of restoration. A revelation of who you are. We search for it. We pursue it. Then one day, you find it. You follow it wherever it leads. No matter what people say. And you may be surprised just what you may find. And the revelations just may change your life forever. Why? Why do you need to know your identity? After all, there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither bond nor free, for we are all one in Christ Jesus. This, of course, being said after the Jews were persecuted and enslaved by the descendants of the Greeks. However, that aside, the question still stands. Why should one know his or her identity and ancestry? Well, the answer is simple. If you're Israel, then the land of Israel is your land. It's literally yours. The Sea of Galilee, it's yours. It's literally yours. Paid in full and given to your forefathers. It's your property. The River Jordan and the holiest city in the entire world, Jerusalem. It belongs to the Most High Yah and the children of Israel. This includes all the territory therein and all its resources. To deny one's inheritance is to willingly give up your valuable possessions for free and instead lay claim to tiny pieces of land in the places in which you were scattered, and pay rent and mortgage to the rulers of the land in which you were scattered. So, why is it important to know your identity? Well, it's important to know what's yours and what's owed back to you. It's also important to know the prophecies which deal specifically with Israel and the Messiah, and being saved from the lands of your captivity. That's why it's important. Maybe you're wondering, are you saying the Jews are black? Well, that's just silly. Everyone knows the Jews are European. You black people, always trying to claim someone else's history. We know what the Jews look like, and you're not it. After all, it's what they told us. and we believe it. Now, of course, we haven't taken the time to verify or perform any research or ask any questions or read any old books. Come to think of it, we just accepted what was told. Oh, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. So, one day you get curious and you want to know for yourself. So you go down to the library and you march right up those steps and you check out an old book on Spain and Portugal, the Jews of Spain and Portugal, to finally determine once and for all who the Jews are. So you open up the old book only to find out, oh, they black. So you take it to your pastor and you say, what's this all about? How come you didn't tell me we Israel? How come you didn't tell me the Jews are black? What other truths have you been hiding from me? What do you mean? What do you mean? If Israel's my homeland, then someone else has my property. That's right. According to the old books, Israel is black. Congratulations, you found the truth. The Jews of Spain and Portugal were black. And if they're black, that means they look like you. However, your excitement quickly turns to sadness and anger when you realize you've been lied to. All this time, people from the church and the so-called historians told you the idea of Israel being black was a lie, made up. However, you found books from the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s describing the Jews as black. As the following reference reads, and it reads, the Spanish Jew is always dark complexion. 'Tis also a vulgar error that the Jews are all black, for this is only true of the Portuguese Jews. Located at the bottom, lips very full, mouth projecting, chin small, and the whole physiognomy, the way they look, when swarthy or when black, as it often is, has an African look. Thus, the black color is found not only in individuals as the Black Jews of Portugal. The Jews of Portugal are very dark. King John II in 1492 expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas, which had been discovered in 1471, and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. And from these banished Jews, the Black Portuguese, as they are called. As you can see, Jews were referred to as black, swarthy, dark complexion, and African looking in the old books. So if anyone tells you that black Jews were dreamed up by some guy in Chicago in the 1960s or some black guy in the late 1800s, now you know that that person either hasn't read old books or he or she is intentionally lying to you. And keep in mind, the evidence doesn't just consist of old books. Proof includes paintings from the 1500s. It includes stone depictions of Jews before the birth of the Messiah. It includes skulls of ancient Spanish and Portuguese Jews, which match present-day Negroes. It includes names of Black Portuguese Jews found on the transatlantic slave ship Manifest. And it also includes DNA. A comprehensive list of overwhelming evidence can be found in movies such as Hebrews to Negroes by Brother Ron Dalton Jr. and the upcoming Reclaiming the Thrones movie by Moraes to Cole Williams and Josh Cullens.
What is the root issue for that hatred towards our black brothers and sisters? The Lord woke me up kind of in the middle of the night, and he answered that question. And the answer was, because they're my chosen people.
In 70 AD, General Vespasian and his son Titus put an end to Jerusalem with great slaughter. Many outrages and atrocities were committed against the remainder of the people. It has been estimated that over 1 million Hebrews fled into the interiors of Africa from Roman persecution and slavery. The slave markets were full of black Hebrew slaves.
To reconnect to your history, you need to do three things. One, you need to redefine who the children of Judah are according to the old references. Not from the 1900s to newer, because those books tend to have a totally, completely different history in those books. So you have to ask yourself, how did we lose this in history? How did you lose 400,000 people in history? And the reason why I say how did you lose 400,000 people in history is not in the books.
Many people in today's time, many Israelites who don't know their heritage or who they are looking back.
Now it is up to us to have eyes to see and ears to hear.
Hallelujah. Yah willing, this truth will reach the four corners of the earth. The undeniable truth of hundreds of thousands of black Jews in Spain and Portugal, less than 10 years before the start of the transatlantic slave trade, in the very countries who started the transatlantic slave trade. You see, in 1492, a great persecution of these black Jews broke out in Portugal by King John II. This history is undisputed. Now, historians, however, often fail to mention the old books which state that these Jews were black. They were literally called Black or Negro Portuguese. which is the Portuguese word for black. Let's see what happens to these Negro Portuguese Jews just before the start of the transatlantic slave trade. The Jews and Moors in Spain, page 214. The King's Creed awoke again simultaneously with the reawakening of his greed. He issued an edict which threw even that of Torquemada in the shade. All Jewish children below 14 years of age were torn from their parents' arms, dragged into the church, baptized. Those under 3 years of age were given to Christians to receive a Christian education, or in other words, to be raised as slaves. Those between 3 and 10 years of age were put on board of a ship and conveyed to the newly discovered unwholesome island of St. Thomas, called the Isles of Perdition, which was colonized by Portuguese condemned criminals to fare there as best they could. Those between 10 and 14 years of age were sold as slaves. Then indeed the cup of their affliction was full to the brim. It was a stern truth which Lanou uttered. The Jews have experienced fully the unequal skill of the church in administering pain. Mothers cast themselves at the feet of the tyrants and pitifully begged to be taken with their babies. They were heartlessly thrust aside. Hundreds of mothers, mad with despair, ran behind the ships as they carried off the idols of their heart and perished in the waves. The serene fortitude with which the exiled people had borne such many and such grievous calamities gave way at last and was replaced by the wildest paroxysms of despair. Piercing shrieks of anguish filled the land. Childless and brokenhearted, they now sought to leave the land, but they were told that they had forfeited their right, and they were given the choice between baptism and slavery. Thousands, after enduring all that they did, after leaving their beloved Spain and all their wealth and ease, submitted to baptism now in the hope of being reunited with their children. Thousands were sold as slaves. Yet, prior to being sold, they were submitted to tortures, cruelties, outrages too revolting, too repulsive, too heartrending to be here narrated. Now, just keep in mind that this is less than 10 years before the start of the transatlantic slave trade against the black Jews of Portugal. And it reads, "Terror seized upon the native Portuguese Jews when they helplessly beheld the cruelties to which their Spanish brethren were subjected. They knew then they themselves could not escape the wrath of the church much longer. And they thought of flight, and well had it been for them had they made their escape then. While they were making secret preparations, John II died in 1495. He had been afflicted on the very day when the ships laden with the Jewish exiled children set sail for the Isle of the condemned criminals with a strange, painful malady, and had lingered ever since. His own promising son and successor preceded him into the grave. His cousin Manuel ascended the throne. He was the counterpart of his predecessor, kind-hearted and a promoter of learning, eager to further the interests of his country by discoveries abroad and by commerce at home. Immediately, he disenfranchised the Jewish exile sold into slavery, promised to recall the condemned children, and issued an edict in which he commanded kind treatment to the Jews, and prohibited accusations against them. In their great joy, the native Portuguese Jews sent an embassy to him, offering him large sums of money voluntarily as a token of their gratitude. The king thanked them, reassured them of his goodwill, but refused to be paid for human kindness. But again had destiny decreed that a woman was to play an ignoble part in the tragic history of the Jews. A marriage was proposed between Manuel of Portugal and the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain. Manuel was rejoiced with the proposal. Already he saw himself the near future king of United Spain and Portugal and of the entire New World. But Satan stepped between, dipped his pen in gall, writing the marriage contract, demanded as one of the conditions the immediate expulsion from Portugal of all the Jews, both natives and exiles. The king hesitated. The fanatical daughter of fanatical parents persisted. Argument made her more vehement. Torquemada might well be proud of his pupil, the possession of vast empires and of the most powerful crown of Europe, tempted and the tempter conquered. He had purchased his right to the Princess of Spain at a sacrifice of thousands and thousands of lives, with the destruction of the very pillars of his nation's prosperity. On the 30th of November, 1497, the marriage contract was signed, and on the 20th of the following month appeared the edict of expulsion of the Jews from Portugal. The scenes of mourning and wailing and heartrending cries which resounded in Spain re-echoed in Portugal, only the more painful because of the terrible knowledge they had since acquired the meaning of the word expulsion. Manuel soon regretted his signing away his most industrious, most intelligent, and most prosperous citizens, but the marriage contract held him fast, and the Spanish queen kept a watchful eye on him, and Torquemada upon both. The prospective vast empire and the Spanish crown still dazzled his eye. He planned a strategy. He thought he could force the parents to embrace Christianity and to remain, if he once succeeded in getting all their children into his power and into the Christian faith. He gave secret orders for the repetition of the atrocious crime of having all children under 14 years of age seized from their mother's bosom and father's arm, dispersed through the kingdom to be baptized and brought up as Christians. The secret became known. Portugal again re-echoed the wails of stricken ones. Fanatic mothers threw their children into deep wells or rivers. Mothers were known to take their babies from their breasts and tear them limb from limb, rather than to resign them to Christians. They would rather know the bodies of their children in the graves and their released spirit in heaven than have them adopt a faith into which Satan sent his friends for their schooling. With all the parents' opposition, the king's order was executed. Many accepted baptism, but not enough to please the king, and to wreak vengeance upon them for thwarting his wishes. He revoked his edict and seized all who had not yet fled and sold them as slaves. These black Spanish and Portuguese Jews were placed on the west coast of Africa in great numbers because they refused to embrace the Roman religion. You can find this information in old books such as the one that was written by John Ogilby in the 1600s, who was the official cosmographer and geographic printer. In John Ogilvy's book, which today retails for around $50,000, on page 574, you can find the truth. And it reads, King John III, King of Portugal, sent a colony there above 200 years before, whom though the unwholesome air destroyed, yet the place was not left desolate. For he sent new inhabitants, who first settled Guinea, next in Angola, and lastly on the island of St. Thomas, that so they might be better used to the air, that the said king sold all those Jews for slaves that refused to embrace the Roman religion, and caused their children to be baptized, from whom, coming there in great numbers, most of the present inhabitants were descended. The black Jews were sent to the west coast of Africa in great numbers, less than 10 years before the start of the transatlantic slave trade. To learn more about the fate of these black Jews, be sure to check out Hidden Hebrews 2 for more shocking truths and evidence. And also check out the upcoming movie Reclaiming the Throne, due out in April of 2020. Now, before ending this video, I'd like to leave you with a scripture from the Messiah, Yeshua HaMashiach. If you ever wondered, what's the most important thing? What's the most important instruction or commandment? Well, let's take a look at the most important thing according to the Messiah himself. Mark chapter 12, verse 28 reads, And one of the scribes, and having heard them reasoning together, and perceiving that he had answered them well, asked him, Which is the first commandment of all? And Yeshua answered him, The first of all commandments is, Hear, O Yisrael, Elohim thy Yahuwah is one. And thou shalt love Yahuwah thy Elohim with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind, and with all thy strength. This is the first commandment. And the second is like, namely this, Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. There is none other commandment greater than these. And the scribe said unto him, Well, master, thou hast said the truth, for there is one Elohim, and there is none other but him. And to love him with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the soul, and with all the strength, and to love his neighbor as himself is more than all whole burnt offerings and sacrifices. And when Yeshua heard that he had answered discreetly, he said unto him, Thou art not far from the kingdom of Elohim. And no man after that durst ask him any questions.
The Jews. The Jews are composed of 3 or 4 separate racial elements. The Asiatic Negroid strain shows itself occasionally with the curly hair, the long eye, and proportions of the skull. The Jewish hybrids with the Negro in Jamaica and Guana reproduce most strikingly the Assyrian type. You see, Jews were called Negro which is the Spanish and Portuguese word for black. Both Spanish and Portuguese Jews were called black Jews. For example, in this quote it reads, King John II in 1492 expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas, which had been discovered in 1471, and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. And from these banished Jews, the black Portuguese, as they are called. It reads, thus the black color is found not only in individuals, as the black Jews of Portugal. And it reads, "'Tis also a vulgar error that the Jews are all black, for this is only true of the Portuguese Jews, who marrying always among one another, beget children like themselves, and consequently the swarthiness of their complexion is entailed upon their whole race, even in the northern regions." Now notice how first-hand accounts line up with Bible verses such as Lamentations chapter 5 verse 10, where it reads, "Our skin is black like an oven because of the terrible famine." Now, not only did Europeans refer to the Jews as black, Arabs also referred to the Jews as black. Now, the Arab word for black is referred to as Sudan. S-U-D-A-N. The following references read, the Arabic word for blacks is Sudan. And then the reference at the bottom reads, they call it Balad Sudan, which means land of the blacks. Sudan is the Arabic word for black person. Now notice that Sudan is spelled two different ways. S-U-D-A-N is the modern day spelling. However, the antiquity spelling was S-O-U-D-A-N, So-U-Dan, which is simply two words combined into one, So-U-Dan. Now, let's use Google Translate to look up the meaning of the words So-U-Dan. Now, we will use Hausa language, which is located in the So-U-Dan, to translate the word Udan. Now, let's take a quick look at the Hebrew meaning of the words so, Yudan. After all, Hebrew is the native tongue of the Jews. To do this, we will start with Strong's Concordance H5471. That's Strong's word H5471, which is so. And if we look at the definition of the word so, it reads of foreign origin. That's of foreign origin. And if we put that together, we look at the Hebrew translation. So means foreigner or of foreign origin. And Yudan equals Judah, which is H3063, which represents the southern kingdom. And if you put the two together, you get foreigners of Judah. So on our map, we have So Yudan, which in Hebrew represents the foreigners of Judah. Now, let's cross-check our Google Translation findings using additional references. For example, the index in the back of the Talmud, Volume 3, reads, Yudan, a variant of Judah in the 4th century. And our next reference reads, Yudan equals Judah. Now, let's take a look at additional references to see exactly who lived in the So Yudan. The Jews. The Jews of So Yudan are, according to my informers, divided into many large and small tribes, with whose names they are unacquainted. Their mode of life in some countries is pastoral. But the towns are filled with traders and artificers of that faith, who gain a substance at their several employments in the service of the Muslims, under whose government they live as vassals. This in reference to Mr. Bodwich's Kingdom of Yehudi. I may be permitted to say, is the only state of society in which that oppressed nation is suffered to live. And the tribes without security in their possessions, without public revenue or arms, are hourly exposed to insult and rampant form of blind zeal, and active bigotry by which their lords are animated in those countries. The lands occupied by those people cover a wide extent between Messina and Kabi. They are said to be mingled also with the Upper Fula tribes, eastward of Timbuktu, and in many parts of Maror. They have inheritance or are employed as artificers in the cities and towns. As we live among the heathens, says Bashar, so do the Jews in Meroah and Fulani with our brethren, but they are not esteemed like us. For they are a people hardened in their sins and obstinate in their fidelity. The anger of Yah is upon them, and therefore are they given to the rule of the Muslims. The Arab Bashar goes on to describe the Jews as brown colored instead of the black color of the Ashanti. The Arabic word So Yudan and the word Negro, which is the Portuguese and Spanish word for black, were bywords that were used to describe the Jews or the house or tribe of Judah. Now, this was foretold in Deuteronomy chapter 28, verse 37, where it reads, And thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations, whither Yah shall lead thee. Now, we will discuss another byword for the Jews, or for the house of Judah. It's one of the more controversial bywords. It's a byword that today causes hurt and pain and often great sadness. However, this controversial byword can be used to identify the true identity of the so-called African American today. The byword is spelled Nigger. It was a byword used to identify slaves that were captured in the Niger Delta region. However, Niger is a relatively modern pronunciation of the word. During the time of antiquity, it was pronounced nigger. Now, the New World Encyclopedia tells us that the Portuguese arrived at the Niger Delta on the coast in 1473. By the 17th century, coastal trade had supplanted the trans-Saharan trade, mostly dealing in slaves. During the years when the slave trade flourished, nearly half the total number of slaves exported from Africa came from the Niger Delta, which came to be known as the Slave Coast. Next, let's read about the people that were taken as slaves who lived in the Niger River region. This next reference comes from John Ogilby of London, who was the official cosmographer and geographic printer of King Charles. And it reads, "Many Jews also are scattered over this region, some natives boasting themselves of Abraham's seed, inhabiting both sides of the river Niger." Others are Asian strangers who fled thither either from the desolation of Jerusalem by Vespasian or from Judea, wasted and depopulated by the Romans, Persians, Saracens, and Christians, or else such came out of Europe, whence they were banished, out of parts of Italy in the year 1342, out of Spain in the year 1462, out of the Low Countries in 1350, out of France in 1403, out of England in 1422. These all differ in habit and are divided into several tribes, having no dominion, though both wealthy and numerous, but despised of all nations, and so abominated by the Turks that they are not permitted to be Mohammedans, unless first baptized, and then no otherwise made use of than to receive their customs and to gather their taxes. Skipping to the bottom paragraph, it reads, "The idolaters are numerous in Negro land, Upper and Lower Ethiopia, and towards the great ocean, except, as we hinted before, some few who by the industry of the Portuguese and the Spain have been converted and baptized in several places." In case you're wondering, who are these black Jews living in the Niger River Delta region on the west coast of Africa? We need look no further than another book authorized by the official cosmographer and geographic printer of King Charles himself. This comes from a book called America, An Accurate Description of the New World by John Ogilby. On page 574, it reads that John III, King of Portugal, sent a colony thither above 200 years before, whom though the unwholesome air destroyed, yet the place was not left desolate. For he sent new inhabitants, who first settled Guinea, next in Angola, and lastly on the island of St. Thomas, that so they might be better used to the air. That the said king sold all those Jews for slaves that refused to embrace the Roman religion, and caused their children to be baptized, from whom, coming thither in great numbers, most of the present inhabitants were descended. So according to John Ogilby of London, the children of the Jews that refused to embrace the Roman religion were placed on the west coast of Africa in great numbers, most of which the present inhabitants were descended. In being baptized, a mark was placed on their hands and on their foreheads. As we read, the cardinals that was to obfuscate being come with the canons of that church. The ceremony was begun with blessing the water. After the proselytes, presented by their godfathers, advanced everyone in his turn and declared their desire to be baptized, then they leaned over the front. The cardinal baptized them, pouring water on their foreheads out of a large silver spoon, and gave them their names. According to the cosmographer and geographic printer of the king, along with additional references, the Black, Portuguese, and Spanish Jews were placed on the west coast of Africa in great numbers. Now, let's look at additional references to see why the Jews were placed on the west coast of Africa. The Jews and Moors in Spain, page 214, and it reads, "The king's creed awoke again simultaneously with the reawakening of his greed. He issued an edict which threw even that of Torquemada in the shade. All Jewish children below 14 years of age were torn from their parents' arms, dragged into the church, baptized. Those under 3 years of age were given to Christians to receive a Christian education, or in other words, to be raised as slaves. Those between 3 and 10 years of age were put on board of a ship, conveyed to the newly discovered unwholesome island of St. Thomas, called the Isles of Perdition, which was colonized by Portuguese condemned criminals, or Portuguese Jews, condemned by the Inquisition, to fare there as best they could. Those between 10 and 14 years were sold as slaves. Then indeed the cup of their affliction was full to the brim. It was a stern truth in which Lemieux uttered when he said, "The Jews have experienced fully the unequal skill of the church in administering pain. Mothers cast themselves at the feet of the tyrants and pitifully begged to be taken with their babies. They were heartlessly thrust aside. Hundreds of mothers, mad with despair, ran behind the ships as they carried off the idols of their heart and perished in the waves. The serene fortitude which the exiled people had borne so many and such grievous calamities gave way at last and was replaced by the wildest paroxysms of despair. Piercing shrieks of anguish filled the land. Childless and heartbroken and brokenhearted, they now sought to leave the land, but they were told that they had forfeited their right, and they were given the choice between baptism and slavery. Thousands, after enduring all that they did, after leaving the beloved Spain and all their wealth and ease, submitted to baptism now, in the hope of being reunited with their children. Thousands were sold as slaves. Yet, prior to being sold, they were submitted to tortures, cruelties, outrageous too revolting, too repulsive, too heartrending to be here narrated. Now, to pause here just for a moment, just keep in mind that these were Black, Portuguese, and Spanish Jews. as the previous references have pointed out. All right, as we continue, terror seized upon the native Portuguese Jews when they helplessly beheld the cruelties to which their Spanish brethren were subjected. They knew then themselves could not escape the wrath of the church much longer. They thought of flight, and well had it been for them had they made their escape then. While they were making secret preparations, John II died, 1495. He had been afflicted on the very day when the ships laden with the Jewish exile children set sail for the isle of the condemned criminals with a strange, painful malady, and had lingered ever since. So King John II, who shipped the children of the Jews to the west coast of Africa, became sick the very day that the ships departed from Portugal. Let's keep reading. It says, his own promising son and successor preceded him into the grave. His cousin Manuel ascended the throne. He was the counterpart of his predecessor, kind-hearted, a promoter of learning, eager to further the interests of his country by discoveries abroad and by commerce at home. Immediately, he disenfranchised the Jewish exiles sold into slavery, promised to recall the condemned children, and issued an edict in which he commanded kind treatment to the Jews and prohibited accusations against them. In their great joy, the native Portuguese Jews sent an embassy to him, offering him large sums of money voluntarily as a token of their gratitude. The king thanked them, reassured them of his goodwill, but refused to be paid for human kindness. But again had destiny decreed that a woman was to play an ignoble part in the tragic history of the Jews. A marriage was proposed between Manuel of Portugal and the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain. Manuel was rejoiced with the proposal. Already he saw himself in the near future king of united Spain and Portugal, and of the entire New World. But Satan stepped between, dipped his pen in gall, and writing the marriage contract, demanded as one of the conditions the immediate expulsion from Portugal of all the Jews, both natives, which is the Portuguese, and exiles, which were the Spanish. The king hesitated. The fanatical daughter of the fanatical parents persisted. Argument made her more vehement. Torquemada might as well be proud of his pupil. The possession of vast empires and of the most powerful crown of Europe tempted and the temper conquered. He had purchased his right to the princess of Spain at a sacrifice of thousands and thousands of lives, and with the destruction of the very pillars of his nation's prosperity. On the 30th of November, 1497, the marriage contract was signed. And on the 20th of the following month appeared the edict of the expulsion of the Jews from Portugal. The scene of mourning and wailing, heartrending cries which resounded in Spain re-echoed in Portugal, only the more painful because of the terrible knowledge that they had since acquired of the meaning of the word expulsion. Manuel soon regretted his signing away his most industrious, most intelligent, and most prosperous citizens, but the marriage contract held him fast, and the Spanish queen kept a watchful eye on him, and Torquemada upon both. The prospective vast empire and Spanish crown still dazzled his eyes. He planned a strategy. He thought he could force the parents to embrace Christianity and to remain if he once succeeded in getting all their children into his power and into the Christian faith. He gave secret orders for the repetition of the atrocious crime of having all children under 14 years of age, seized from their mother's bosom and father's arm, dispersed through the kingdom to be baptized, and brought up as Christians. The secret became known. Portugal again re-echoed the wails of stricken ones. Frantic mothers threw their children into deep wells or rivers. Mothers were known to take their babies from their breast and tear them limb from limb, rather than resign them to Christians. They would rather know the bodies of their children in the grave and their released spirit in heaven than have them adopt a faith into which Satan sent his friends. With all the parents' opposition, the king's order was executed. Many accepted baptism, but not enough to please the king, and to wreak vengeance upon them for thwarting his wishes. He revoked his edict, seized all who had not yet fled, and sold them for slaves.
What happened to the children? What happened to the children? What became of the children of these rebellious Jews that refused to embrace the Roman religion? What became of the children of the Jews that sacrificed their lives, and in some cases their children, to make a stand for the laws, statutes, and commandments and their beliefs in the Most High? What became of those children? In order to answer this question, we need to look no further than the ones who enslaved the children themselves. But we first need to understand that the Jews of Spain and Portugal claim their descent from the tribe of Judah. As the following reference reads, it says, the Spanish and the Portuguese Jews claim their descent from the tribe of Judah. And with that in mind, the slavers who took the children and carried the children to the west coast of Africa named the place that they sent the children after the children. On the west coast of Africa, the Portuguese slavers named the slave coast the Kingdom of Judah. And the next reference also confirms that the children that were taken to the west coast of Africa resided in the Kingdom of Judah. As the following quote reads, it reads, Wida or Judah or Ajuda is a city old, frequented since the 16th century by the Portuguese slavers who gave it its name. Its inhabitants were said to be Judaic, and they were indeed considered as a remnant of the scattered tribes of Israel. And the next quote reads, east of the Great Popo begins the Dahomey territory, guarded by the important town of Gliwice, known to Europeans by various names of Fida, Hueda, Wida, Wida. The old writers called it Judah, and its inhabitants were said to be Jews, while the neighboring river, Alala, whose real name was Ephraim, during the flourishing days of the slave coast, from 16 to 18,000 were annually transported from Judah. As the Portuguese called this place? All right, so let's do a brief recap of what we've learned so far. We learned that the Portuguese shipped the children of the rebellious house of Judah, or the tribe of Judah, who refused to embrace the Roman religion. These children were sent or shipped to the west coast of Africa in great numbers. We also learned that the Portuguese named the place that they sent the children of the house or tribe of Judah to. These Portuguese named the place after the children. They named the place the Kingdom of Judah. And we also learned that these children were raised to be Christians and to be slaves. Now, let's cross-check our findings using additional references. Now, previous references show the king of Portugal taking all the children of the rebellious house or tribe of Judah from the ages of 14 years of age and younger to be raised as Christians and slaves. However, additional references show this age was later increased to children in their 20s. For example, in this reference, the Jews of Spain and Portugal and the Inquisition, it reads, "A fresh edict went forth that all the children between the ages of 14 and 20 should also be taken from their parents and baptized, and multitudes were dragged forcibly by their hair and by their arms into the churches, and compelled to receive the waters of baptism, together with new names, being afterwards given over to those who undertook to instruct them in the Christian faith." Now, let's check the Transatlantic Slave Trade database, which contains almost 36,000 slaving voyages on record. We will use its database of roughly 96,000 slave entries to review the ages of Jews enslaved. Let's see if these slaves were middle-aged men and women in their 30s and 40s, as often seen in modern-day portrayals of this transatlantic slave trade. Or let's see if there was something more sinister in the cargo of these slave ships. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade database, the number of slaves above the age of 30 was only 6 to 7%. Roughly 6 to 7% of slaves were above the age of 30. This means that roughly 94 to 93% of those on the transatlantic slave ships were younger than 30 years old. Closer inspection shows a disturbing truth of those that were on the ships. And Bible scripture specifically foretold that the children of Israel would go into captivity, because Israel abandoned Yah's laws, statutes, and commandments. Of the 93 to 94% of those that were under 30 years of age, 2% were babies and toddlers. 27% were of elementary school age, and roughly 16% were of high school age. And of those on the transatlantic slave ships, roughly 21% were of college age. And lastly, 28% were young adults in their mid to upper 20s.
And this was foretold in the scriptures as far as the children going into captivity. Deuteronomy 28 verse 32 reads, "Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long, and there shall be no might in thine hand." Deuteronomy 28 verse 41 reads, "Thou shalt beget sons and daughters, but thou shalt not enjoy them, for they shall go into captivity." Verse 6 reads, "The children also of Judah and the children of Jerusalem have ye sold unto the Grecians, that ye might remove them far from their border." It was foretold that they would be forcefully removed from their borders in Joel 3, and that Judah would be scattered throughout the world. Deuteronomy 28 verse 64 reads, "And Yah shall scatter thee among all people, from one end of the earth even unto the other. And there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone." Now, according to the scriptures, the children of Judah were scattered across the four corners of the earth into slavery. And as the references stated time and time again, they were to be raised as Christians and slaves, as the following references confirm. The top references read, "To receive a Christian education," or in other words, to be raised as slaves. Or our next reference at the bottom reads, "Sold all those Jews for slaves that refused to embrace the Roman religion, and caused their children to be baptized." And this is the baptism into Christianity. And it says, "From whom these children coming thither," which is the west coast of Africa, "in great numbers, most of the present inhabitants were descended." Now, the children of the rebellious house of Judah, who refused to embrace the Roman religion, were raised in the Christian doctrine. These slaves shipped to the New World learned the principles of their new faith from their masters. As the following quote reads, it reads, "We had the best mistress and master in the world. They was Christian folk, and they taught us to be Christian-like too. Every Sunday morning, old master would have all us to the house, while he would sing and pray and read the Bible to us all. Old master taught us not to be bad. He taught us to be good. He taught us to never steal nor to tell false tales, and not to do anything that was bad. He said, you will reap what you sow, and that you sow it single and reap it double. I learned that when I was a little child, and I ain't forget it yet. When I got grown, I went the Baptist way. God called my papa to preach. Old master let him preach in the kitchen and in the backyard under the trees. On preaching day, old master took his whole family and all the slaves to church with him. Now, in addition to learning to never steal and to never tell false tales, they were also taught that the laws, statutes, and commandments of the Most High were done away with. They were also taught new holy days and to disregard the holy days of the Bible. And they were also taught that they were the descendants of Ham which is Gentiles, instead of being the children of Israel. The next reference reads, Pope Pius V, by nature a sinister ecclesiastic, delighting in persecution, who treated Jews as the cursed children of Ham, was succeeded by Gregory VIII, who had been skillfully trained to fanaticism by the Jesuits and Tridentine monks. As regard Jews, Gregory was a most consistent follower of the cruelty of his predecessor. In summary, the children received a Roman makeover, courtesy of the Pope, the one who calls himself the Vicar of Christ, which means the replacement of Christ, whose name equals 666, which is the number of Satan. They caused the children of Judah to embrace the very religion their forefathers died and often made great sacrifice opposing. Now, you may wonder, what is the difference between these new Roman Christian Jews and the Israelites of old? Well, let's take a closer look. Not only did writers know that the children of the rebellious house of Judah were sent into slavery and were scattered to the four corners of the earth, they also knew who held the children of Judah captive. And for that, let's read a quick reference from Modern Judaism from a book that was written in the 1800s. And it reads, first, that the descendants of Esau, the sworn enemies of the descendants of Jacob, even to the end of the world, were at first a small nation, inhabiting Mount Seir and the adjacent country, contiguous to the land of Canaan, that they were easily confined within their own limits, as long as the Israelites enjoyed a great and formidable empire in Canaan. But that after the powerful republic of the 12 tribes was destroyed by the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they wonderfully increased in numbers and strength, extended their dominion towards the west, spread their colonies far and wide, subjugated Italy, founded Rome and the Roman Empire, at length entirely overturned the Jewish state, which had been restored after the termination of the Babylonian captivity. The second temple being destroyed by Titus Vespasian, and that in the present day professing the religion of Jesus of Nazareth, which they were the first of all nations to embrace. They hold the dominion over all Europe, Esau detaining in captivity his brother Jacob, at least as far as regards the tribe of Judah, till his Messiah, Ben David or Yeshua, shall appear. So during the time of the 1800s, these writers wrote that the descendants of Esau detained in captivity his brother Jacob, at least as far as regards the tribe of Judah. And just to read a little bit more, it reads, secondly, that the prophecies of the prophets against Esau, Edom, Seir, and the cities of Edom, especially those of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Obadiah, have not yet received their full accomplishment, for that thou, the house of Esau, has experienced some particular judgments of God on account of the injuries at different periods of time and afflicted upon Israel. Yet the final vengeance on account of that last and greatest injury, the destruction of the second temple by Titus, and listen, the transportation of the Jews into captivity, in which they are still most opprobriously detained, is yet impending over it, to be executed in the time of the Messiah. All right. Well, as you can see, this reference points to the Jews being in captivity to Esau, and according to the scriptures, that they would remain in captivity or in the land of their captivity until the Messiah returns. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 10. Therefore, fear thou not, O my servant Jacob, saith Yah, neither be dismayed, O Israel, for lo, I will save thee from afar, and thy seed from the land of their captivity. Now, as a whole, there's really only one people on the face of the earth that as a people still live in the land that they once served as captives. And it is the same people that were scattered across the four corners of the earth via the transatlantic slave trade. And it is also the same people that were placed on the west coast of Africa in great numbers by the expulsion edicts and by the Inquisition. All right, so let's keep reading. It says, I will save thee from afar, and thy seed, your children, from the land of their captivity. And Jacob shall return, and shall be in rest, and be quiet, and none shall make him afraid. For I am with thee, saith Yah, to save thee, though I make a full end of all nations, whether I have scattered thee. Yet will I not make a full end of thee, but I will correct thee in measure, and will not leave thee altogether unpunished. For thus saith Yah, thy bruise is incurable, and thy wound is grievous. There is none that plead thy cause, that thou mayest be bound up, that has no healing medicines. All thy lovers have forgotten thee, they seek thee not. For I have wounded thee with a wound of an enemy, with the chastisement of a cruel one. For the multitude of thine iniquity, or the word iniquity means lawlessness, so it means for the multitude of thine lawlessness, because of thy sins, breaking of the commandments, which sins were increased. Let's read that again. It says, for the multitude of thine lawlessness, because thy sins were increased. Verse 15 reads, why criest thou for thine affliction? Thy sorrow is incurable for the multitude of thine lawlessness. Because thy sins were increased, I have done these things unto thee. Therefore, all they that devour thee shall be devoured. All thine adversaries, every one of them, shall go into captivity. And they that spoil thee shall be a spoil. And all they that prey upon thee will I give for a prey. For I will restore health unto thee. I will heal thee of thy wounds, saith Yah. Because they called thee an outcast, saying Yah, this is Zion, whom no man seeketh after. Thus saith Yah, behold, I will bring again the captivity of Jacob's tent, or the freedom, and have mercy on his dwellings. And the city shall be built upon her own heap, and the place and the palace shall remain after the manner thereof. And out of them shall proceed thanksgiving, and the voice of them that make merry. I will multiply them, and they shall not be few. I will also glorify them, they shall not be small. Their children also shall be as aforetime, and their congregation shall be established before me. And I will punish all that oppress them, and their nobles shall be of themselves, and their governor shall proceed from the midst of them. And I will cause him to draw near, and he shall approach unto me. And who is this that engaged his heart to approach me, saith Yah? And you shall be my people, and I will be your Elohim. Behold, the whirlwind of Yah goeth forth with fury, a continuing whirlwind. It shall fall with pain upon the head of the wicked. The fierce anger of Yah shall not return until he have done it, and until he have performed the intents of his heart. In the latter days you shall consider. All right, well, we've reached the end of Hidden Hebrews Part 2, and hopefully you've learned a lot. Hopefully you've learned, according to first-hand accounts, that it was the Jews of the tribe of Judah, or the house of Judah. Their children were placed on the west coast of Africa in great numbers because their parents refused to embrace the Roman religion. And these children were to be raised as Christians and as slaves. And through the transatlantic slave trade, these children were shipped to the four corners of the earth. And that to this day, they live in the lands in which they were once held captives until Christ returns. Now, until then, the children are charged to live peacefully among men, and above all, turn back to the laws, statutes, and commandments as best they can.
the Son, you shall conquer.
And this was the supposed vision of the Roman Emperor Constantine, also called Pontifex Maximus, which means high priest of the Christian church. And now let's pick up where we left off. And it reads, after mature deliberation of the affair, he commanded that all the Jews and Moors in Portugal who would not profess the Christian religion to depart the kingdom, and set them a day, after which, if any of them were found there, they should forfeit their liberty. The Moors immediately passed over into Africa, and as the Jews were preparing to depart, the king commanded that all their children who were not above 14 years old, that they should be taken from their parents and educated in the Christian religion. It was a most affecting thing to see children snatched from the embraces of their mothers and fathers embracing their children, violently torn from them, and even beat with clubs. To hear the dreadful cries they made, every place filled with the lamentations and yells of women. Many through indignation threw their sons into pits, and others killed them with their own hands. What added to their misery was that those who would have gone over to Africa to avoid these evils were not suffered, for the king deferred giving them liberty of sailing day after day. And although at first he assigned them 3 ports where they might go on board, he afterwards forbid them their sailing from any other but that of Lisbon. This brought a vast number of Jews to that city, but in the meanwhile the appointed day was past, so that such of them as could not get off were necessarily made slaves. Most of them, being overcome with these calamities, chose rather, either sincerely or feignedly, to make profession to Christianity. Now, some of the rebellious house of Judah accepted Christianity in order to save their lives, their children, and their property. However, many didn't fully accept the religion headed by the Pope, headed by the one who calls himself the replacement of Christ, whose name equals 666, which is the number of Satan. Now, just so that we don't forget the physical description of these Jews, let's review the following references. The following reference speaks to the color of the Jews, and it reads, and from these banished Jews, the black Portuguese, as they are called, and the Jews in Luanga. The next reference reads, 'tis also a vulgar error that the Jews are all black, for this is only true of the Portuguese Jews, who marrying always among one another, beget children like themselves. And lastly, the following reference reads, are Jews white like you? No, replied I, rather more like yourself, very dark. Now these black, brown, swarthy, dark-skinned Jews chose secretly to practice their religion, as the following reference reads, and it reads, but as these Jews did not profess the Catholic faith truly and heartily,
but feigned and externally, they remained as much Jews as they were before, and so much the more dangerous because concealed. Now let's take a closer look at the Inquisition to see how it affected the parents of the rebellious house of Judah, who were left behind in Europe. A long, long time ago, when the power of the Pope reigned supreme, the one who calls himself the replacement of Christ saw the religion of the rebellious house of Judah spreading throughout his dominion. And in order to put a stop to these commandment keepers, he created the Inquisition. And the following quote reads, King Emmanuel was succeeded by John III in 1521, who, observing that Judaism spread greatly in his time, that the Jews publicly professed their errors and taught them others, that his domestic servants, not only such as proceeded from them, but those who were ancient Christians, were infected with the poison of their doctrine, condemned the sacraments of the church, did not receive them in the article of death, treated with great irreverence holy images, and especially some of the Virgin Mother of God, the Lady of Angels. They are the words of Sosa. Considering these things in his mind, he desired of Pope Clement VII, the holy tribunal of the Inquisition, in his kingdom. And although this pope for a long while and oftentimes refused it, through the vigorous endeavors of the Jews who to their utmost opposed the royal petition, for the Jews always hated this holy tribunal, as others do to this day, for what reason they know best. Yet at length, with difficulty, he granted it in the form of law. January 16th, 1531. Now, keep in mind that the Jews in Spain and Portugal and within the Roman dominion were black, brown, swarthy, dark-skinned Jews. As the following quote reads, it reads, He was of a middle size. He had good features in his face. The skin somewhat black, black curly hair, long eyebrows, and of the same color, so that one might easily know by his looks that he was descended from Portuguese Jews. All right. Now, the Inquisition was the Pope's police, judge, jury, and executioner, all rolled up into one institution. Their primary focus was to stamp out all remnants of the religion of the rebellious house of Judah. To carry out this purpose, the Pope outlawed all practices or beliefs that he, being the so-called replacement of Christ, did not create, authorize, or approve. Let's take a closer look at the things outlawed by the Pope and the Inquisition. And the following reference reads, And first, if you know or have heard that any man or woman have kept or observed any Sabbath, according to the rites, ceremonies, and observances of the law of Moses, and on the said days have put on clean a fresh shirt and other garments, or better, handsomer and holy clothes, or have laid clean napkins on the table and clean sheets on the bed in honor of the said Sabbath, or have not blown up or nor kindled their fire, or have abstained from all their work on the said Sabbath, and begun to keep them from Friday evening, or who have celebrated the Passover of unleavened bread, beginning this sort of food with lettuce, parsley, and other green herbs, or have observed the Passover of tabernacles, by fixing up green burls or rich tapestry, feasting and accepting each other's invitation to eat and drink. Or if they expect the Messiah promised in the law, or have said that the Messiah promised in the law is not yet come, but is to come, and that they yet expect him to deliver them from that bondage, which they say they are under, and to lead them into the promised land. And as you can see, these are just a few of the things that were outlawed by the Pope. And ironically, these are things that both Christ and the apostles observed when they walked the earth. And also, this doctrine of the Pope was an all-out assault on the laws, statutes, and commandments of the Most High. All right, well, some of the things outlawed by the Pope, by the one who calls himself the replacement of Christ, he outlaws the Most High's Sabbath, which is the fourth of the 10 Commandments, which was written by the very finger of the Most High Yah himself. And the Pope also outlaws resting on the Sabbath, as well as outlawing all of the Most High's holy days or his feast days, including Passover and Tabernacles. And finally, but not limited to, the Pope also outlaws the Jews believing that the Messiah will deliver them from their present bondage. Now, keep in mind, the Christian church, led by the Pope, didn't persecute the Jews because they didn't believe in Christ. Because according to references, some Jews did in fact believe in Christ. Instead, the Roman Christian church persecuted the Jews, or the rebellious house of Yehuda, for believing or for observing the laws, statutes, and commandments of the Most High. And in turn, they made it against the law to do so. Now, let's read the following Bible verses to see how the Most High, Yah, Christ, and the apostles felt about Yah's Sabbaths, about his holy days. Now, for this, let's go over to Leviticus chapter 23, and let's start at verse 1. And it reads, "And Yah spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them concerning the feast of Yah, which you shall proclaim to be holy convocations, or holy gatherings. Even these are my feast." Now notice in this verse, it says these are my feasts, which means these are the feasts of the Most High Yah. Now, continuing on, let's read verse 3. It says, 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest and holy convocation, or a holy gathering. You shall do no work therein, and it is the Sabbath of Yah in all your dwellings. So again, we see that this is Yah's Sabbath. It's not the Sabbath of the Jews, but this is in fact the Sabbath of the Most High Yah. Now let's go over to verse 4, and it reads, "These are the feast of Yah, even holy convocations," or holy gatherings, "which you shall proclaim in their seasons. In the 4th day of the 1st month at even is Yah's Passover." So again, we see that this is the Most High's Passover. And if we continue with verse 6, it reads, "And on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread unto Yah. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread."
All right. Now let's go over to our next quote, our next scripture. And for this, let's do Exodus chapter 12. And let's drop down to verse 17. And it reads, "And you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread, for in this selfsame day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore shall you observe this day in your generations by an ordinance forever." So notice that the instructions from the Most High Yah is that this ordinance or this observation of this day, of this feast day, is forever. All right, so now let's drop down to verse 24, and it reads, actually, let's start at verse 23, and it reads, "For Yah will pass through to smite the Egyptians, and when he seeth the blood upon the lintel and on the two side posts, Yah will pass over the door, and will not suffer the destroyer to come in unto your houses to smite you. And you shall observe this thing for an ordinance to thee and to thy sons forever." All right. So we notice that these holy days were in fact supposed to be observed forever. All right. Now for our next scripture. Let's read Matthew verse 26. And let's start at verse 2. And it reads, actually, I'll start at verse 1 and read down. And it says, "And it came to pass when Yeshua had finished all these sayings, he said unto his disciples, You know that after 2 days is the feast of Passover, and the Son of Man is betrayed to be crucified." All right, so now let's also drop down to verse 17. And it reads, "Now the first day of the feast of unleavened bread, the disciples came to Yeshua, saying unto him, Where wilt thou that we prepare thee to eat the Passover?" So here we see that Christ and his disciples were not only observing the feast of unleavened bread, but they were also observing the feast of Passover. Christ and the apostles. And let's see what Christ says. And he says, "And he said, Go into the city to such a man and say unto him, The master saith, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples." And verse 18 reads, "And he said, Go into the city to such a man and say unto him, The master saith, My time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at thy house with my disciples." All right, so now we see here clearly that Christ and his disciples observed the Passover. Now let's move over to our next reference, next quote. And for this, let's go over to Mark chapter 14 and verse 12. And it reads, "And the first day of unleavened bread, when they killed the Passover, his disciples said unto him, Where wilt thou go, that we go and prepare, that thou mayest eat the Passover?" All right, so again, we see that Christ and the disciples observed the Passover. All right, so for our next quote, it comes from Luke chapter 2, verse 41, and it reads, "Now his parents went to Jerusalem every year at the feast of Passover." All right, so we see that even Christ's parents went to Jerusalem to observe the Passover. And then last but not least, this comes from Acts chapter 20 and verse 6, where it reads, "And we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, came unto them to Troas in 5 days, where we abode 7 days." All right. So we see that even after the death and resurrection of Christ, that the apostles still observed the feast of unleavened bread. All right. Well, next, let's take a look at the way in which the Christian church persecuted and killed those of the rebellious house of Judah, because they refused to abandon the laws, statutes, commandments, and the holy days and the Sabbaths of the Most High Yah. Well, Israel, I must warn you. The references in history you're about to hear will be tough for some, but this history must be given back to you. Let's review. And it reads, it was under this state of things that the humane and benevolent spirit of Christianity dawned upon the followers of Abraham and Moses by burning, roasting, torturing, and maiming, and finally putting to death more than 1/2 of the Hebrew race. It is well-established history that in France alone, thousands of Jews were burned at the stake. On one occasion, 160 men, women, and children were bound hand and foot and thrown into a ditch. Wood was piled on and the torch applied, while numbers of priests stood by with uplifted hands, calling on their Savior. To witness the suffering of the unbelieving Jews, whole families were burned in this funeral pyre, for the reason that pious Christians could not see them separated. In other words, the Christians couldn't just burn one or two members of the family. To them, it only seemed right to burn the whole family. Now, this reference hints at the scale in which the church killed or persecuted those of the house of Judah. It says the church under the Pope killed over half of the Hebrew race. We know that the descendants of Judah were numerous in Spain and Portugal. For example, the following reference reads, these miserable people, as well as the Jews, who then abounded in Spain. And the house of Judah was persecuted so severely by the Christian church that they were all but wiped out from the face of Europe. As the following quote reads, and it reads, 10 persons only were relaxed and 170 subjected to penance. Those who were burnt had relapsed into Judaism. The Jews had been so severely persecuted in the preceding reigns that scarcely any remained. Now, during the time of the Inquisition, the rebellious house of Judah almost always made up the greatest portion of those who were killed by the church. These execution ceremonies were called auto de fes, or acts of faith, in which the victims were burned. For example, this next quote reads, on the 17th of June, 1565, an auto de fe of 45 persons was celebrated. 11 were burnt and 34 condemned to penance. It reads, some of these were Lutherans, but the greater number were Jews. Now, before killing off the rebellious house of Judah, in these auto de fes, the Christian church would first arrest these black, brown, swarthy Jews. They then confiscated the property of the Jews. They then forced the Jews to admit to breaking the Pope's laws. They then were required to pledge allegiance to the so-called replacement of Christ and his doctrine. If they refused, they were tortured until they repented or submitted. And if they did not repent or submit, they were killed by burning. Let's read the following reference, and it reads, the prisoner who refused to confess
or whose confession was deemed imperfect, was remained to his cell and left to ponder in solitude and darkness. Except in rare cases, time was no object with the Inquisition. It could afford to wait. Perhaps in a few weeks, his resolution might break down, or he might ask to be heard. If not, 6 months might elapse before he was again called up for hearing. If still obstinate, he would again be sent back. Months would lead into years, and perhaps years into decades, and find him still unconvicted and still a prisoner, hopeless and despairing. Should friendly death not intervene, the terrible patience of the Inquisition was nearly certain to triumph in the end, and the authorities all agree upon the effectiveness of this delay. And on to our next reference, which reads, "From the hall of the tribunal, the prisoner was led immediately unto the torture chamber. This was a sort of subterranean prison or ward, dark and unhealthy." Now, as a quick side note, note that these prisons were below ground. They were sometimes even underneath the floor of the very sanctuary in the Christian church. Now, let's keep reading, and it reads, "From the hall of the tribunal, the prisoner was led immediately into the torture chamber. This was a sort of subterranean prison or ward, dark and unhealthy. It was also surrounded with thick and solid walls to prevent the cries of the victim from being heard on the outside. In the torture chamber, the accused found himself in the presence of 4 masked men. Whom he had seen in the hall. On every side surrounded them were instruments of torture, such as iron boots, cords, enormous nails, thumb screws, etc. And in a distant corner, a lighted brazier, whose lurid flames cast a deadly light on all these somber objects. Before coming to this dungeon, the accused had to pass through winding, moist, and slippery passageways. He was preceded by a turnkey and followed by 4 constables, all armed. Flight and resistance were impossible. And our next reference reads, "Both bishop and inquisitor ought rightfully to be present. The prisoner was shown the implements of torture and urged to confess. On his refusal, he was stripped and bound by the executioners, and again entreated to speak, with promise of mercy in all cases in which mercy could be shown. This frequency produced the desired results. Skipping ahead, in the case of continued obstinacy, additional implements of torture were exhibited, and the sufferer was told that he would be subjected to them all in turn. If still undaunted, he was unbound, and the next or 3rd day was appointed for renewal of the affliction. According to the rule, torture could not be applied but once, but this, like all other rules for protection of the accused, was easily eluded. It was only necessary to order not a repetition, but a continuance of the torture. And no matter how long the interval, the holy causes were able to continue it indefinitely." And our next reference reads, "The horrid barbarities which are still practiced under the cloak of religion in Spanish prisons of the Holy Inquisition would be scarcely credible to an English reader, if they were not too well attested
to leave any doubt whatsoever of their existence. The Jesuits of the Inquisition in Portugal had also 3 prisons appropriated to the same purpose. One in Lisbon, another in Evora, and a third in Coimbra. I was informed by the guards and other inferior officers of the Inquisition that they were in the practice of employing at least 5 different species of torture inflicted on innocent individuals, either by way of revenge for some imaginary offense against the gross ordinances of popery, or else for the purpose of extorting confessions from the wretched victims concerning any subject the principal inquisitors thought fit to propose. These different kinds of torture, which they dignify with the name of the treatment, are as follows: the swinging treatment, the running treatment, the sharp treatment, the water treatment, and the fire. However, all agree in stating that the sufferers of the prisoners were greater under the water treatment than that of the roasting of feet. It is usual for one of the principal inquisitors to be present during the infliction of these abominable cruelties, in order to give direction for varying the mode of punishment according to the circumstance, until they extort something like a confession from the wretched victim. It is also not uncommon for the lives of the wretched victims to fall a sacrifice during the tortures, to which they are subjected, or in other words, that they die. In that case, their bodies are thrown into holes or pits, and quicklime thrown over them, so as to speedily consume the flesh, is all destroyed. The bones are then preserved in boxes with the initials of the victims on each box, and kept in a room appropriated for that purpose, called the bone room. Now, let's pause for a moment to confirm who was getting persecuted in great numbers by the Inquisition, by the church. We read that it was the Jews who were persecuted and killed by the church so severely that they were all but completely wiped out of Europe. We also read that the Jews made up the majority of those who were in prison. And with that in mind, let's cross-check our findings using an additional reference. Let's read about the physical description of those who were in prison and killed by the Inquisition. And the following reference reads, having dressed himself and put on a black garment striped with white lines, and a pair of drawers, which they had brought for him, he was led into the galleries, where he was joined about 200 other prisoners, all arranged against the walls. They were mostly colored men, there being only about 12 white persons among them. The Inquisition persecuted and killed colored people. These people made up the majority of those killed by the church under the authority of the Pope, who calls himself the replacement of Christ. Again, the church persecuted the rebellious house of Judah by first arresting them, then confiscating their property, torturing them. Then, if they did not submit to the Pope's doctrine, they were condemned to die at the Alto de Fe. Alto de Fe, called the Acts of Faith, was the last stop for the rebellious house of Judah. After being arrested and enduring great torture, the patience of the Inquisition inquisitor had come to an end. At last, they sentenced Judah to death by fire. If they accepted Christianity now, they would be strangled before being burned. However, if they persisted with Yah's laws, statutes, and commandments to the end, they would be burned alive. Now, a very important note about the Alto de Fe: the Christian church chose a special day to burn or kill its colored, black, brown, swarthy, dark-skinned descendants of the house of Yehuda. The church preferred to burn its colored people on Sunday, during Sunday service, as the following reference reads. When a competent number of prisoners are convicted of heresy, either by their own voluntary or exhorted confession, or upon the evidence of witnesses, a day is fixed by the chief inquisitor for a gold delivery, which is called by them an act of faith, and which is always upon a Sunday. And our next reference reads, Sunday became prescribed for it, and as no other sermons were allowed on that day in the city, it was forbidden to be held on Advent Sunday or any other principal feast days. Notice was given in advance from all the pulpits, summoning all the people to be present and obtain the indulgence of 40 days. A staging was erected in the center of the church, on which the penitents were placed, surrounded by the secular and clerical officials. The sermon was delivered by the inquisitor, after which the oath of obedience was administered to the representatives of the civil power, and a solemn decree of excommunication was fulfillment against all who should in any manner impede the operations of the holy office. Then the notary commenced reading the confessions one by one in the vulgar tongue, and as each was finished, the culprit was asked if he acknowledged it to be true. Care being taken, however, only to do this when he was known to be truly penitent, and not likely to create scandal by a denial. On his replying in the affirmative, he was asked whether he would repent or lose body and soul by persevering in heresy. And our next reference reads, the prisoners tortured. Auto de Fe generally solemnized the first Sunday in Advent. Now, Auto de Fe ceremonies would start with a procession or a parade to the church or the city square. Bishops and clergy of the church would hold torches as they slowly walked with those condemned to be burned. The colored people destined to be burned wore sanbenitos, which included a tall cone-shaped hat. While walking to the place of execution, church bishops would continuously urge its colored prisoners or the rebellious house of Judah to reconcile with the Church of Rome, or in other words, throw away Yah's laws, statutes, and commandments. Once they reached the church or the city square, they were tied to stakes with wood piles underneath. And the following reference reads, it reads, so great was his bitterness and fury against those unhappy people, that in a boasting manner and by way of a proverb, he used to say, give me a Jew, and I'll render him back to you to the burnt. The prisoners were tied to stakes
with wood piles underneath for burning. Their faces were also tied to the poles to make it easier to burn the beards of the rebellious house of Yehuda. Just before the prisoners were to be burned, a bishop would ask one last time if they would be reconciled to the Church of Rome. And if they refused, they were burned. As the following reference reads, and it reads, "With the aforementioned board, they turned about the people, and the Jesuits do spend near a quarter of an hour in exhorting the professed to be reconciled to the Church of Rome, which if the professed refuse to be, the Jesuits come down, and the executioner ascends, and having turned the professed off the ladder upon the seat, and chained their bodies close to the stakes, he leaves them, and the Jesuits go up to them a second time to renew their exhortation to them, and at parting tell them that they leave them to the devil, who is standing at their elbow to receive their souls, and carry them with him into the flames of hellfire, so soon as they are out of their bodies. Upon this a great shout is raised, and as soon as the Jesuits are off the ladder, the cry is, 'Let the dogs' beards be made! Let the dogs' beards be made!' In other words, burn the beards of the men of the rebellious house of Yehuda, which is done by thrusting of flaming furs fastened to a long pole against their faces. And this inhumanity is commonly continued until their faces are burned." And the following reference reads, "The prisoners that are to be burned alive, besides a familiar, which all have, the rest have a Jesuit on each hand of them, who are continually preaching to them to abjure their heresies, or in other words, to stop their heresies or stop obeying the laws, statutes, and commandments." And it reads, "But if they offer to speak anything in defense of the doctrine, for professing which they are going to suffer death, they are immediately gagged and not suffered to speak anymore. This I saw done to a prisoner presently after he came out of the gates of the Inquisition. Skipping ahead, there is a scaffold erected which may hold 2,000 or 3,000 people. At the one end sit the inquisitors, and at the other end the prisoners. And in the same order as they walked in the procession, those that are to be burnt being seated on the highest benches behind the rest, and which may be 10 feet above the floor of the scaffold. After some prayers and a sermon, which is made upon excommunions on the Inquisition, and invectives against heretics, a secular priest ascends a desk, which stands near the middle of the scaffold, and who, having first taken all abjurations of the penitents, who kneel before him one by one, in the same order as they walked in the procession, at last he recites the final sentence of the Inquisition upon those who are to be put to death. The proceedings of the auto de fe concluded when the descendants of the rebellious house of Yehuda was burned and killed by the church. The church often commemorated the burning of these colored people by hanging clothes representing the deceased up high in the rafters of the church. This served as a stark reminder for those who would think to turn back to the laws, statutes, and commandments of the Most High Yah. However, not all auto de fe's unfolded as planned. This particular auto de fe was one that was remembered for many years to come. Let's take a closer look.
a Jew, and his wife, and a daughter of about 13 years of age, being condemned to be burnt. While the father and mother were burning, they set the child loose from its fetters, and the priests got around it with a view of converting it by the united force of their rhetoric and the terrors of immediately undergoing the same cruel death. The child, after seemingly to listen for a while to their origin, gave her answer by jumping into the flames. This heroic act of a 13-year-old girl shocked the people attending the Auto de Fe to its core, that her sacrifice shut down the Auto de Fe in Madrid for 12 years. No one knows how many lives her selfless act saved for those 12 years. However, we do know that she cherished the laws, statutes, and commandments of the Most High Yah above life itself. Israel, these are your forefathers. All right. Well, before we conclude video 3 in our Hidden Hebrews 3 series, I'd like to provide one additional reference. While listening to this documentary, you may have wondered how the atrocities of the Inquisition apply to the modern church. Now, the modern day churches all come out of the Catholic Church. For example, if you see the chart on your screen, you'll see on the far right, you'll see the modern churches like Methodists and Baptists and Adventists and Pentecostal. However, you'll also notice that on the left-hand side, all of these churches come out of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, although these churches may differ from one another, they do share some common values, some of which were values that were decreed by the Pope, who is the so-called replacement of Christ, and the Roman Emperor Constantine. So let's take a look at one of these shared values which were adopted by the Protestant and Lutherans during the time of the Inquisition. And it reads, "It will not do so to say that these persecutions were all by the Catholics. During most of the time they were in progress, there was no other Christian church. But even after the Protestants gained the ascendancy, there was no abatement of these cruelties. Luther and Calvin, while claiming the utmost liberty of conscience for themselves, denied it to all others. Luther denounced Copernicus, the astronomer, and says his biographer, he looked with a favorable eye on the adoption of violent measures for the conversion of the Jews and others." So although these churches were different, they all shared their hatred for the children of Yehuda. All right, well, let's wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground in our video. We learned that the parents of the rebellious house of Yehuda were severely persecuted and killed by the church, headed by the Pope. We also learned that the church executed the families of Yehuda on Sunday during church service. And we also learned that the main reason that the families of Yehuda were executed was because they followed the laws, statutes, and commandments of the Most High Yah. So I'd like to thank you for watching the video.
Y'all willing, I'll add the references to the description section in this video as well. Please be sure to like the video and share it with as many as possible. Very few people know about the Inquisition and its toll on the people of color. It's a history that every Israelite should know because these are your forefathers. Well, thanks again for watching, and shalom.